Amen. That was an interesting ending.
I was trying to end it early.
I'm just saying it was interesting. It is so good to be back, and it is so good to just be at home. It's good because I was telling somebody who was visiting, I said, I'm just telling you, this is not an hour-long Catholic Mass. We take our time. We live, we love, we breathe, and we enjoy one another. Amen? And I hate, it's awful. It can be awful to go to another church and then you're as a Catholic and as a priest. So this is maybe not very humble because that's really what the gospel is about today. But when you go, you end up, well, I have a friend who's a painter and a drywall expert. So every time you go out with him, he's looking at the shadows on things. Oh, that's really bad over there. And look at that holiday over there. Like, shut up. I can't see any of that. Yeah. Well, going to Mass somewhere is a bit like that. It's kind of that feeling. You're looking at all the things the priest is doing wrong, like that 34-minute and 30-second Mass I was at a few weeks ago in Ireland. And it was like, oh my God, they got it all in. It was super fast. But the priest then, and this drives me nuts, what he did was he retold the story of all of the readings we just heard. Now, I'm like, I usually have a little read of them beforehand to know what's happening. And if I'm preaching, I haven't been doing it all week. But to retell what we just heard, we could all hear, we could all read. We don't need you to tell us what we just heard. So we're not doing that. I had the great joy of being invited just after I got back to a priest friend of mine's 70th birthday party. And one of the three things, it was a dinner party, what are the three things that you should never talk about in polite company, Miss Manners or whoever decides these things? What are the three things you should never talk about? Politics, religion. You're all shy about the third one. What's the word? What's the word? Okay, we're at a Catholic church. We're all shouting sex. So that's what I was told. Now, the host is a woman who voted for you-know-who in the White House. And this priest told me, now she's a really nice person. We've had some knockdown, drag-out issues, so we cannot talk about politics. And then she's an atheist, so we cannot talk about religion. We're with a priest who's turning 70 with low testosterone in his mind, and he has no thought of sex. So after about half an hour of the hors d'oeuvres, several people said to me, wow, Father Aidan, you're very quiet. Because I was having a hard time thinking about things to say when you wipe those three things off the topic matter. But luckily, towards the end, we got into the dining table. They had all those lovely calligraphy name places, so I didn't have to choose to be at the top or the bottom of the table. I just was right in the middle where I like to be because I'm an extrovert, and therefore I want to be in the center of things. That's not a surprise to you, I know. But anyway, at the end of that particular party, some lady who I didn't know before actually decided, can we all just tell our friend how we feel about him and why we're here? Now that was a moment where he sat crying because everybody got to tell him how much they loved him and who he was. And that was a very powerful moment. So sex, politics, and religion didn't matter in that moment. Friendship was the powerful thing. He was honored, and we continued to celebrate the great gift of his birthday party banquet. Today in the readings is an invitation also to a banquet. But in this context, we have the readings from Sirach. Now, if you open a Protestant Bible, you are not going to find this particular book in there. Because somewhere in the beginning of the church, both the Jewish Torah and the Protestants, when they eventually came to the reform of the church, took these books out. But from Nicaea in the 3rd century forward, we in our church, we were the only church up until a long time, decided to keep it in. It was kept in because it's wisdom literature. It is from the voice of the feminine face of God, written through Sirach. And the idea is that we are invited into the mindset of God. Jesus Christ came into the world for the purpose of communicating to you and I, through the centuries and in this moment, the mindset of God. The mindset of God, and invites all of us to be bridges and to invite human flourishing. And to the extent that anything takes away from that, then it is not of God, I would suggest to you. And so to be humble, to be close to the earth, humus is the Latin root and the Greek word, so that you are close to the earth and you are invited, and we are invited to be humble. So when you think of that meter on your computer of your security settings or your privacy settings or any of those settings, where on those settings is, even if you're aware of it, where are those settings for you? Where are those settings for me? Are they set somewhere in the middle? Are you even aware of how humble you're invited to be? Have you seen the Master? Have you listened to his voice? And have you checked in with yourself and your ego? Because let's face it, folks, the ego always wants to be in charge. The ego always wants to be right. And God is not about the ego. And in these readings today, we're told in a very powerful way, this theophany, this moment of an eschatological moment that we're told about in Hebrews, is every person. Mount Zion is in every person, even if you're months away from being 100 years old, to the littlest person in the church. All of us have all of everything that was said in Hebrews from the moment of the great covenant on Mount Sinai, celebrated in Jesus Christ, is in every person. And I mean every person. That is why this week I put in the bulletin the article that Father Brian Massingale has written for Dignity this week. He says, as a black man, as a theologian, as a priest, and as a gay man, that he had to come out into the world to say who he is. And he says, if you don't accept part of me, you don't accept me at all. The invitation is that we are called to love everyone. In Luke's gospel, it is the great reversal. It is the big overarching theme of all of Luke's gospel. Think of Matthew 25. The opposite of what we see, the opposite of our ego, the opposite of our social climbing, the opposite of our entitlement to think we are supposed to be in a certain place. That attacks white privilege. It attacks anything that takes away of seeing the other than less than us. Amen? So today, Jesus is invited into the big house. You know the big house? And it's with the big people. And it's with the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees only want to talk about one thing in this context, and that's the resurrection. The Pharisees, not all Jews, believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did not. They stuck to the law. They were into the purification rites, of course. They're in the house, and Jesus is invited to talk religion, theology, study of God. But they're all watching Jesus. They're watching his every move. In fact, in this moment, just as he got to the door, I think there was a plant. Now, I don't know why the church doesn't put this reading in, but there's a man with dropsy, which is like, have you ever seen that when somebody's face drops I think it's an infection of some sort. But anybody who had any bodily discolorations or disformity were impure, therefore of sin. and to touch them or be with them or have them around would make you impure. Therefore, you couldn't have come to the feast. Jesus meets them at the door and says, is it unlawful to cure someone on the Sabbath? So almost immediately, he is challenging them, and obviously they set him up. I think it wouldn't be here. So he's on his own. There's no mention of the other. His posse's not with him, I don't think. They're not mentioned, but they could have been. And so he goes ahead and cures anyway because it's the right thing to do. And then he says to them, oh, but is it okay to pull your ox or your donkey or your ass out of a hole? I mean the animal, just in case you're all. A well in the ground. And they're not going to answer him because according to the law, they shouldn't be working. Like, for example, if you're in Israel and you're there on the Sabbath, do not get into a Shabbat elevator. You know why? Because in a big building, you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, so pushing a button is considered work. So the elevator will stop on every single floor. I found this out to my own. I'm like, what is going on with this elevator? It's a Shabbat elevator. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, and these things can be taken to great extremes. But Jesus is watching them, and he uses their and his social convention. He's recognizing that there is a moment where we're all caught up in our quid pro quo. We're all you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. I want to be at the top table. Who doesn't want to be at the top table? In fact, we all do in some way, sense. We want to be honored for the gift of who we are, but we have to keep that in check. We almost must look to the humus close to the ground. I remember Frederica von Stade, who was with us at St. Martin de Porres board, and I remember she's the world-class mezzo-soprano in the world at one time. She's on our board, and there she is with her butt sticking up out of the dirt, pulling weeds a couple of years ago when we had the school. I took a picture. She says, Father, if you put my butt on Facebook, you're in trouble. There she is, painting and piling kids into her car and trying to use all of her gifts and talents. To the extent that anybody moves up the ladder of wherever they are in life, that extent should be to their humility. Our church could learn a lot from this. Our bishops are those Pharisees that take this stuff way too seriously. We are the people of God. Therefore, we should all be honored collectively. Amen? So it is in that context that we must be self-reflective. We must be woke. And then Jesus uses that moment and he says to them, why don't you just go to the bottom of the pile? That is the great reversal. That is the reversal that God is the author of all life, human and divine. God is the judge. God is the lens. And it is through that lens of the great reversal of humility to go to the bottom of the pile. And then he turns to the one who is who's invited Jesus. And then he says to him too, you must invite the lame, the widow, the orphan, and those who cannot repay you. That is the way. And so for us, as on this day, we are all invited to be a little more humble, a little more giving, a little more caring, and a little more connected to reality. I would like to suggest to you through David Rico a way in which all of us can be a little more humble and a little more checking in with the reality of our lives so that we are a little more humble, that we live a little more authentically. We're not talking perfection. We're not talking sainthood. So in humility, that's it. So this didn't work this morning. And technology is always great when it does work. So 5 things that David Rico, who's a great spiritual writer in the Buddhist and Christian and all world religions context, sort of universal understanding of self. So the first thing is everything changes and ends. To the extent that you and I fight this, or think, my ego thinks, this shouldn't happen to me, or nothing should end, or nothing should change, get over yourself. It is wasted energy in your life. When I first came here 10 years ago, Cressida Reed, I know I'm outing her. She probably knows. She's probably listening on the streaming. By the way, you should be in church, Cressida. So anyway, she came to my door and she banged on it. She had a present that I've never looked into. It was a box of some sort. She banged on the door and she goes, I wanted Father Jason to stay here. I didn't want Father Jason to move. I don't know why you're here. I don't know who you are. And I said, hi, you want to come in? She stayed 4 hours. She drank my beer and then she left. And we became good friends. But she is an example to me of a person in jest that really hates change, doesn't want anything to change, doesn't want anything to end. But to the extent that you do not, and I do not, accept the gift of change in our lives, then you're fighting reality. You're not being particularly humble, and you're allowing your ego to take over. Not all plans work out. Oh my God. If that's not Murphy's Law, if you've lived long enough, not everything works out the way we want it to do. That marriage may not work out. That friendship, that crazy family may not work out. On and on and on, and all plans work out. Again, if you fight that stuff and you think it's all about you, you're going to be lost. The next thing is pain comes with life. The longer you live, the more you realize that it's just part and parcel of what it is. It's not happening to you that it's not happening to every other person on the planet. A few weeks ago, when I on the 15th of August, I did a funeral mass with my friend Brian, who used to be 4 priests in his parish. He's the only one now. He has 3 churches, and he could only do 1 mass for the feast of the Assumption on the 15th of August. He asked me to come celebrate, but the problem was, in doing 1 mass for the whole parish, there was also a funeral. And the funeral was in the midst of a feast day mass, and it was of a 51-year-old woman who had taken her life. And it's really difficult to lift that up and celebrate the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or even to get into the theology or the understanding of what that all means. And we were going a little long, and he whispered to me, can you take this burial and get me out of this situation, because I have another burial coming in at 12 o'clock. So I said, okay. But in his homily, he said, we are people of hope. We have Jesus Christ. You should not grieve, is what he said. And I just winced, because I realized, yeah, you should grieve. So when I got to the cemetery, which turned out to be a 5th or 6th century cemetery from the time of St. Patrick, with a little old church and a very ancient graveyard, where Catholics had buried since the year dot until now. The Reformation happened 1,000 years later, but Catholics still bury there. Who knew? I didn't. And here we were, with these 150 people standing around the grave. And it is a quick celebration. You put the casket down, you say the prayers, and you're gone. I decided to use my own moment of pain and grief to allow these people to grieve. And so I said to the Mother Teresa, you are a mother, and a mother and father should never have to bury their own child. It is wrong order, and I know it's pain and suffering. And we have not talked about the fact that the woman lying in this grave took her own life. This is about suicide. And priests in Ireland just seem to not want to call what is. And so it ends up making this sort of collusion and not allowing people to talk about what needs to be said or feel what needs to be felt. And so I said, I have lost my own father in the same way. They are in the hands of the God who loves them, who's hopelessly loved. And you cannot judge them because you have not walked in their footsteps. You have not walked their journey or their path, or have felt their pain and their darkness. and they went home to God. Yes, you can be angry. Yes, it's horrible. Yes, it's a lightning hot pain. Pain comes with life. But acknowledging it and learning from it and growing a little bit can help us be more compassionate and be empathetic to one another. Life is not always fair. Oh my God, I did not get the richest parish in the Diocese of Oakland. I got sent to St. Columba. Thank you. She said, but you are in the richest parish in the Diocese of Oakland. And I agree with that. But on the hierarchy of things and how others see it, sometimes you look through the lens of how others feel about where you are or what you're doing. And so life is not always fair, but it's plans and how plans come. Murphy's Law again, blame the Irish. The last thing is, people are not all loving and all caring all the time, including ourselves. And I put that last piece in because I've read that many times, and I realized that it also applies to me. I am not going to be the best pastor all the time, although I try. I'm not going to be the best human being or the best friend or the best brother and sister all the time, although I try. And so, to the extent that you and I can follow these and other sensible, rational ways, invites us to be on our heads close to the earth and to be humble. To be humble in a way not to be a dirt rag for anybody, because human flourishing does not call for that, but to be wise about the gifts and talents and who we are, celebrate who we are, and accept everyone. Please notice that when it comes to the Eucharistic prayer and the consecration, I didn't change from the many. I kept the all because I fundamentally believe that God invites all people. Amen? And so we have to understand that in our own lives, and we have to live it. And then you have to look into your own soul and say, wow, where is my meter? Where and how humble can I be about my life? And can I be challenged? Can I accept constructive criticism? Can I be the person that God is calling me to be? And so that generosity of spirit is how those people in the gospel and the great reversal are told. It's not on American sensibilities that the gospel is being promoted in this country or the Western world or anywhere in the world for that matter. It is the great reversal of God's love that will judge us on how we pull up to the table of the Lord. It reminds me of the story of the man or the people who go to heaven and they go into two big rooms. One is hell and the other is heaven. In heaven, in this particular hell, it's the same big room. It is the same big table full of all the sumptuous feast of everything that you could imagine. But everybody has these great big long forks tied to their arms. And they can't get to the food in hell. And then they go next door. Same size of hall. Same feast. But what's happening over there? Everybody's happy. Because what are they doing? They're feeding one another with the big long forks. The difference is how we treat, how we love. Our church needs to listen to the gospel it preaches. Amen? It needs to look at itself with the face and put Jesus Christ back at the center of who we are and who we're called to be. Stop all the power movements and the social movements and all the rest of it. Speak truth to power. Tell it like it is. But you know what? Sometimes they're just so corrupt in the upper parts of the church. There's people, I was reading this book, Tangent. I was reading this book on homosexuality in the Vatican and all why Pope Francis canceled his trip or canceled his pontificate. And they said that when Pope Benedict, when he got to Cuba, there was such powerful abuse going on, and many and sexual immorality amongst the bishops and all of the people over there. What had happened was that the government of the communist country that is Cuba knew everything and had the dirt on all of them. So that episcopacy and that church kept its mouth shut, because if you ever speak up and speak against human rights, we will blow you out of the water. Quid pro quo. And it was at that moment the book suggests that Pope Benedict decided to resign, that the whole thing was just horribly wrong and somebody else could take it on. We're invited always as church and as the people of God to look into our own hearts. This is not about somebody else. I want to hold up for you just St. Peter Claver, because St. Peter Claver was somebody who just didn't know anything about himself as a young man. And he's up here on our wall, and we hold him in very high esteem. We have the Knights of Peter Claver and the Ladies of Peter Claver. And 2 years ago, Father Jay of happy memory, makes me want to cry just to think of Jay, even to feel that he's gone. We all went to Cartagena, where he was as a saint, a Jesuit saint. And when he was in Barcelona as a young man, he just didn't know himself. He wouldn't have known anything about these 5 things. He was a rich young fool who couldn't make up his mind about anything, couldn't decide to be a Jesuit, couldn't decide to be ordained, couldn't decide anything. And his spiritual director said, "Why don't you go out into the new world? Why don't you go to the new Spain?" And so he went to Cartagena. And on the first few days that he was there, now, I'm going to say this. This was Spain in that century, in slavery, and all of the church as it was right there. But one of his brothers took him down into one of the slave ships that was coming into the harbor. And the moment he opened that trapdoor and got down in amongst God's people, he realized he was home. He knew his vocation, and he realized that he must tender to the wounds and the hurts and the pain of the people that were coming across that terrible mid-Atlantic journey. And so for the next 50-odd years, he was the priest that was the prolific baptizer. And he paid heavily for it, because the Spanish people, and especially the ladies in the city, would not go to a mass that Peter Claver would ever say, because he was with those black people. And so some of those things still prevail, but he did not ever for a minute not take on his own vocation. He baptized hundreds of thousands of people. You and I are not called to baptize hundreds of thousands of people. What we're called to do is live the gospel in humility in our own lives, to look for the places to be authentic, to see the generosity that we're called to, and not look for repayment. My sisters and brothers, we are called to human flourishing. We are called to be bridge builders, and we are called to be Christ in the world, to bring Christ to all God's people, irregardless of who they are. Amen. Amen. I don't think irregardless is a word, is it? Irregardless.